Have you ever had someone bang on your door before sunrise and demand access to your private dock like they owned it? Because that's exactly what happened to me. Daniel Foster, 58, retired civil engineer and proud owner of a lakeside cabin my grandfather built long before anyone around here ever dreamed of gated communities or HOA charters. It was just after 7 a.m. when the knock came. More of a pounding, really, rattling the screen door of my grandfather's old cabin like a battering ram. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee, standing barefoot in the kitchen, listening to loons call from the lake, peaceful, serene, exactly what I'd come up here for. That peace shattered the moment I opened the door and found her on my porch. "Mr. Foster," she snapped, without so much as a good morning. "You need to unlock the dock. We've got guests." There she was, Margaret Kelman, president of the Lakeshore Estates HOA and self-proclaimed steward of all things community-oriented. Dressed like she'd wandered out of a country club catalog, behind her stood 4 people in pastel resort wear, clutching lattes and Bluetooth speakers, looking like they expected someone to offer them complimentary boat rides and mimosas. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and polite, "but this is private property. My dock isn't open to the public." Margaret's painted smile froze. "That's ridiculous. All lakefront properties are part of the Shared Waterfront Access Program. It's in the community charter." "Margaret," I said, already feeling my blood pressure tick up, "my grandfather bought this land in 1937. Your development wasn't even a concept until the late 1980s. My cabin sits outside the Lakeshore Estates boundary lines. Always has, always will. That dock is mine." I pointed to the rusted iron boundary marker, half buried in the pine needles 10 feet from where we stood. "There's your line. This," I gestured at the cabin, "the dock beyond, and the stretch of shoreline wrapped in morning mist, is not yours." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't care what some ancient survey says. We've been using this dock for our guest tours for years." That was news to me. I'd certainly never given anyone permission. But something in the way her guests looked away told me it was true. They'd probably posed for Instagram selfies on my boat more than once. "Well," I said, "you'll stop now." Margaret's jaw clenched. She pulled out her phone and started tapping furiously. "I'm calling security. You clearly don't understand how things work around here." I smiled. "No, Margaret, you don't understand how property rights work. But I'd be happy to give you a crash course." Her guests started fidgeting, one woman muttering about not signing up for this kind of drama. Margaret ignored them, her phone pressed to her ear, walking off the porch like she owned the place. And that was the beginning. That morning's confrontation would be just the first volley in what turned into a months-long war. One that would dig up hidden paperwork, expose HOA boundary fraud, and bring an entire community's dirty dealings into the light. But standing on that porch, coffee growing cold in my hand, I had no idea how far Margaret Kelman would go to claim what wasn't hers, or how ready I'd have to be to fight back. The morning after Margaret Kelman's little parade up to my doorstep, I found myself staring at the faint outline of boot prints in the dew-covered pine needles near my dock. 5 sets of them, weaving from the gravel access path to the dock gate and back again. They didn't belong to deer or raccoons. These were HOA guests, entitled people convinced my slice of shoreline was just an extension of their weekend playground. That's when I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate assumption of control, one that had probably been going on for years behind my back. I brewed another pot of coffee and hauled open the creaky roll-top desk in the corner of the living room. My grandfather's old command station. He'd kept every important document in that desk, and I figured if there was proof of my family's land rights, it would be in there. Beneath a stack of yellowed maps and rusted tackle catalogs, I found it. A metal lockbox, the kind with a tiny keyhole and dented corners. I dug around until I found the key in a taped envelope labeled, "In case of idiots." That made me laugh out loud. Grandpa always did have a way with words. Inside were papers that smelled like time itself, original land deeds, property surveys dated 1952 and 1978, and most importantly, a brittle, notarized agreement from 1984, a water rights exclusion document. It had my grandfather's signature and a county seal, clearly stating that the Foster property would remain independent from any future development covenants, including shared amenities and HOAs. Boom. With my legal ammunition in hand, I headed into town to visit the county records office. Martha Jenkins, the clerk, sat behind the same scuffed counter she'd probably manned for 30 years. When I introduced myself, her eyes lit up. "Oh, the old Foster place," she said, smiling. "Haven't had someone from that family in here in a while. Your grandfather was a smart man. He made sure no one could touch that land." Martha typed away at her computer, pulling up the digital files tied to my parcel. As we scrolled through the history, one entry caught my eye. A filing from 2018. The Lakeshore HOA had attempted to redraw the development's boundary lines, citing ambiguous lakefront property assignments included in their expansion proposal. My land, along with a handful of other shoreline properties. But this was rejected, I said, pointing at the screen. "Right?" Martha nodded. "Denied due to lack of supporting documentation. But look here, there's no indication that affected landowners were ever notified. That's not exactly legal." So the HOA had tried to annex my property behind my back, and failed. But they never stopped acting like they'd succeeded. "This kind of thing happens more than you'd think," Martha added quietly. "HOAs trying to swallow up unclaimed territory, especially when it's waterfront. Most folks don't even check until it's too late." I left the office with certified copies of every relevant document and a headache pulsing at my temples. The kind of headache that comes from realizing someone has been casually trying to steal from you while smiling to your face. When I got back to the cabin, I walked the full perimeter of the property and installed security cameras. 2 near the dock, 1 pointed at the road, and another covering the trail leading in from the woods. By sunset, I had a full 360-degree field of view. Good thing, too. At night, just after 11 p.m., the camera facing the shoreline pinged my phone. I opened the app and stared at the screen. 2 men in Lakeshore State security uniforms, walking the property line, flashlights in hand, one of them taking measurements and the other snapping photos of my dock. I slipped on a jacket and walked down to confront them, my phone recording the whole exchange. "Evening, gentlemen," I said, stepping into their flashlight beams. "Care to explain what you're doing trespassing on private land?" The younger of the 2 stammered. Routine boundary maintenance, sir." "Routine boundary maintenance? On property you don't own?" The older man gave him a sharp look and muttered, "Margaret won't like this." Before turning to leave, "Margaret's going to like a lot of things less once I press charges," I said, watching them disappear into the darkness. The next morning, I got an email from the Lakeshore HOA. The subject line, "Architectural violation, action required." It claimed my dock failed to meet community aesthetic standards and must be modified within 30 days. There was even a list of requirements: paint color, railing height, and approved lighting fixtures. And just in case I was unclear about who was in charge, the email ended with a reminder: all Silver Lake properties are subject to architectural review per Section 7.3 of the Community Charter. That would have been hilarious if it weren't so insulting. I printed the email and added it to my growing file labeled HOA Shenanigans. It was clear now Margaret wasn't confused. She was orchestrating a quiet campaign of pressure and intimidation, hoping I'd cave, sell, or at least give up the dock. She didn't know who she was dealing with. By noon, I'd scheduled an appointment with Malcolm Reynolds, a property rights attorney recommended by a neighbor who'd had his own run-ins with an overreaching HOA. Malcolm had a reputation for one thing: suing HOAs into submission. When I showed him the documents, the surveys, the security footage, and the violation email, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a slow smile. "This is textbook," he said. "They're testing your defenses, seeing how far they can push. But you've got history, law, and documentation on your side." He gave me a legal checklist of next steps, starting with filing a cease and desist and putting the county on notice. But he also warned me, "This is about power, Daniel. Margaret's trying to make an example out of you. If she can claim your dock, the rest of the shoreline will fall in line." I nodded. Then she picked the wrong shoreline. The battle for my land had officially begun, and Margaret Kelman was about to learn that the quiet guy with the fishing boat and the coffee mug wasn't going anywhere. 2 weeks after my meeting with Malcolm Reynolds, I thought things had quieted down. No unexpected visits, no emails filled with vague threats. The loons were back to calling across the lake at dawn, and the days were bookended by campfires and trout sizzling in the skillet. For a moment, I let myself believe Margaret had realized she'd overstepped. Then I came back from a quick grocery run in town and nearly dropped my bag of ice. A work van was parked beside my cabin, and a man in a gray polo with a tool belt was crouched by the dock gate, installing what looked like a keypad lock. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man looked up, startled. "Just installing a community access lock, sir. Got a work order right here." He fished a clipboard from the van and showed me a printed work order. At the top, in bold type, Lakeshore Estates HOA, Community Dock Access Control Installation. At the bottom, scrawled in all caps block letters, authorized by M. Kelman. "Let me stop you right there," I said, taking out my phone and hitting record. "This is private property. You are trespassing and attempting to modify a structure without permission. You're going to put that drill down. Get back in your van and wait here while I call the sheriff." His eyes went wide. I'm just doing my job, man." "Then your job's about to earn you a criminal trespass charge." To his credit, the locksmith didn't argue. He packed up quickly and waited by his van while I made the call. Deputy Wilson, the same one who'd helped me before, was there within 20 minutes. After reviewing the paperwork and confirming the boundary lines, he turned to the locksmith and said plainly, "You have no legal right to be here. Leave." As the van pulled away in a cloud of dust, my phone rang. Margaret. Her voice blasted through the speaker before I could even greet her. "How dare you interfere with HOA business?" she screeched. "That dock is listed as Community Dock Number 3. We have 15 guests arriving this weekend for the Lake Tour fundraiser, and you are making this very difficult." I stayed calm. "Margaret, the sheriff is here right now. Would you like to explain to him why you authorized construction on private land without consent?" Silence. Then the call disconnected. Deputy Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Persistent one, isn't she? Like mildew," I muttered. He chuckled and handed me his card. "File a formal complaint. And if anything else happens, you call me first." That evening, I got an email from the HOA's attorney. This time it was less snide and more threatening. They accused me of interfering with established community access points and hinted at legal action. Attached to the email was a shoddy map, clearly doctored, labeling my dock as part of their community amenity structure. I forwarded the email and the map to Malcolm. His reply came back almost instantly. "They're digging deeper." The next day, flyers started showing up in my neighbors' mailboxes. Cheap color prints announcing the upcoming Silver Lake Scenic Dock Tour, with scheduled stops at 5 waterfront spots. Dock Number 3, a photo of my dock with my boat clearly visible, was front and center. I marched over to Doug Peterson's place. He lived a few lots down and had been wary of the HOA from the beginning. "Did you get one of these?" I asked, holding up the flyer. Doug's mouth twisted into a grimace. "Yeah, that your dock on there?" "Sure is. Without permission." "Margaret's playing a dangerous game," he muttered. Malcolm drafted a cease and desist that afternoon, demanding the immediate removal of any imagery of my property from their materials and cancellation of any public use plans involving my land. We sent it certified return receipt. The following morning, while sipping coffee on my porch, I saw movement at the shoreline. 3 people, Margaret and 2 of her board members, were standing on the grass near my dock, gesturing, pointing, and clearly mid-argument. I slipped on my shoes and quietly walked to the corner of the cabin, where one of the security cameras had full audio and visual range. "He can't stop progress," Margaret said, her voice clipped but urgent. "This dock is key to the tour. One way or another, we're using it." "You're sure?" one board member asked, nervously. "We're already under scrutiny. We need this to happen," Margaret insisted. "We can't show the investors just 4 docks. It'll look amateur. I stepped into view. Their heads whipped toward me. Margaret plastered on a fake smile. Daniel, just discussing improvements to the shoreline. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Get off my property, I said. Now. They turned and left without another word. That afternoon, I received a certified letter from the HOA, this time offering to purchase an access easement to my dock for $5,000. The language was almost comically coercive. If I refused, the letter warned, I could face community enforcement actions and potential liens for accumulated violations. I scanned it, then fed it directly into the shredder. Margaret wasn't just testing boundaries anymore. She was trying to rewrite them. I called Malcolm again. They're pushing hard because they're on the edge, he said. This lake tour isn't about community pride. It's about investors. Investors. Yep, I did some digging. They've got expansion plans, new homes, new lots. But those sales depend on them having access to all 5 waterfront points. Your dock included. I exhaled slowly. So I'm a marketing feature. To them, yes. To us, you're the brick wall in their path. That Friday, as the sun dipped behind the pines and the lake turned gold, I stood on the dock and watched the wind ripple across the water. I'd never felt more protective of this place, of its peace, its legacy, its silence. Saturday was coming. So was the HOA. But this time I wasn't just defending a few feet of dock. I was defending history, and I wasn't alone. Saturday morning dawned like a scene from a postcard. Brilliant blue skies, sun sparkling on the lake, and a breeze just strong enough to ripple the pine trees, but not enough to disturb the water's glassy surface. It was the kind of perfect day that made Silver Lake worth fighting for. I had been up since 6 a.m., not from nerves but from preparation. The private property, no trespassing signs were freshly posted and aligned with my legal property markers. My security cameras were fully charged and operational. My phone was clipped to my belt, pre-dialed to the sheriff's non-emergency number. I wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and a calm expression. The kind that unsettles bullies more than shouting ever could. By 9:30 a.m., the show began. 3 luxury SUVs pulled up in formation like some HOA military convoy. Doors opened with smooth hydraulic sighs, and out stepped Margaret Kelman in white linen, a wide-brimmed sun hat, and a practiced smile. Behind her trailed 15 guests in boat shoes and cashmere wraps, sipping from insulated wine tumblers and adjusting their sunglasses. From my porch, coffee in hand, I watched them fan out across the gravel drive, eyes scanning the shoreline like they were scouting a vineyard estate. Standing next to me was Doug Peterson, loyal and scowling. He wore a "Don't Tread on Me" hoodie and held a GoPro. "Showtime," Doug muttered. "Indeed," Margaret called out cheerfully as if we were hosting a garden party. "Good morning, everyone. We'll begin our tour right here at this charming rustic dock. Please watch your step. Nature can be uneven." The guests chuckled politely. Clustering like polite sheep, they began inching toward my dock, some already raising their phones for photos. I stepped off the porch, walking calmly to the head of the path. "I'm sorry," I said loud enough for all to hear, "but this is private property. You don't have permission to use my dock." Margaret didn't miss a beat. "Daniel, let's not cause a scene. These are important members of the community. They're here to support the development." "My property is not part of your development," I said, "and I'm not causing a scene. I'm enforcing the law." One of the guests, a tall older man with a silver goatee and a Patagonia vest, frowned and lowered his phone. "I thought this dock was part of the community tour." "It's not," I replied, stepping forward. "It never has been." Margaret's smile wavered. "There's been some confusion over boundary lines, but it's all being resolved. Mr. Foster is just upset over a minor administrative issue." "Margaret," I said calmly, "I have documentation proving that my property is independent and excluded from your HOA. I have 3 generations of surveys, a water rights exemption, and a pending restraining order against you." The silver-haired man turned to her. "Is that true? You've been showing us private property." She forced a chuckle. These parcels should be part of the community. That was always the intent. It's selfish to control lake access when we're building a unified development for everyone. So you admit this isn't your property? Asked. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the lake lapping against the shore. Then came the crunch of tires on gravel. A sheriff's cruiser pulled into the driveway. Deputy Wilson stepped out, his mirrored sunglasses flashing in the sunlight. "Morning, Mr. Foster. Trouble again." "Same as before," I said. "Uninvited guests." Margaret rushed to intercept him. "Deputy, this is all a misunderstanding. We're hosting a sanctioned community tour. These guests were told this dock was part of the shared waterfront program." Wilson nodded slowly. "And do you have written permission from Mr. Foster to include his dock in that tour?" "Well, no," she admitted. "But the development's charter doesn't apply to his property." "I've already verified that," Wilson said firmly. He turned to the guests. "Folks, unless you've got express permission from the property owner, I'll have to ask you to remain on HOA land." Several guests had already begun backing away. The man in the vest stepped forward and extended his hand. "Edward Harrington," he said to me, "lead investor in Lakeshore Estates." So this was him, the man whose checkbook fueled Margaret's empire. "I think we need to talk," he said quietly. "I'd be happy to," I replied, "preferably after your group leaves my dock alone." Margaret's face had turned the color of boiled lobster. "Edward, please, we can still salvage." "No, Margaret," he interrupted, his voice cold. "You told us this property was part of the HOA. You used images of his dock in your promotional material. You told me he had signed an easement agreement." I thought he would," she said weakly. Wilson turned to me. "Would you like to press charges?" I looked at Margaret, who now looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her guests were drifting away. Embarrassed, confused. The tour had collapsed like a souffle under a cold stare. "Not today," I said. "I think the message has been delivered." Edward handed me his business card. "I'd still like to speak with you soon. I think there's more going on here than just a boundary dispute." I'd agree. By 10:15, the last SUV rolled out. Margaret didn't speak another word. She climbed in the passenger seat and stared straight ahead. Lips pressed thin. Doug gave a low whistle. That was satisfying. I exhaled slowly and looked out over the lake. My dock was quiet again, untouched, respected. But I knew now that this wasn't over. Edward Harrington was involved, and that changed everything. He had money, lawyers, influence, and he'd just learned Margaret had been playing him. And if he decided to act, Silver Lake would never be the same again. Saturday morning had been a turning point. Monday was the reckoning. I arrived at the county courthouse for our temporary restraining order hearing dressed like a man ready for battle. Button-down shirt, polished boots, and a briefcase filled with evidence. Malcolm Reynolds, calm as ever, met me out front with a nod and a quiet, "You're going to like what's inside." We walked into the courtroom and froze. There, already seated at the petitioner's table, was Edward Harrington, investor, financial powerhouse, and newly minted ally. Flanking him was a team of attorneys in tailored suits. Malcolm chuckled under his breath. Guess he moved fast. As the judge entered, Harrington stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I'm requesting to be added as an interested party to these proceedings. As the primary investor in the Lakeshore Estates development, I have reason to believe I've been misled about property rights and amenities, specifically regarding Mr. Foster's land." The judge, eyebrows raised but intrigued, allowed it. Over the next hour, Malcolm presented our evidence. The historic deeds, boundary surveys, the water rights exclusion document, and footage of Margaret's attempted dock takeover. Then Edward's lawyers submitted their own. Printed brochures, investor decks, even internal HOA communications in which Margaret explicitly referred to my dock as secured for community use. One memo included the phrase, "Once the Foster property is neutralized, we can proceed with the North Shore expansion." The judge didn't say much, but her silence was thunderous. By noon, The temporary restraining order was granted and extended for 30 days pending a full hearing. The HOA was forbidden from accessing or referencing my property in any official materials, and any further attempts to do so would be treated as harassment or trespassing. Margaret didn't show up. That afternoon, Harrington convened an emergency meeting of Lakeshore Estates investors. Though I wasn't present, Malcolm had a source who was. Apparently, Harrington laid out the evidence with brutal precision: misrepresentation, boundary fraud, unauthorized use of investor funds for legal defense actions Margaret hadn't disclosed. By Wednesday, she was removed as HOA president. Pending a full investigation, it would have been enough. But the story didn't end there. On Thursday morning, I got a knock on my cabin door. A man in his 70s stood on the porch, wide-brimmed hat in hand. His weathered face looked vaguely familiar. "Thomas Jenkins," he said, offering a hand. "My family's lived next to this lake since before they built those fancy tennis courts. Heard about what happened with Margaret. Thought it was time I paid you a visit." We sat on the porch with lemonade, and Thomas told me the stories I'd never heard. Of how the HOA had quietly pushed its way up the shoreline for years. How they'd told elderly neighbors they were in violation for having unapproved paint colors. How they'd replaced old property markers with new, suspiciously adjusted ones. How families like his had been pressured to sell for their own good. "They've been doing it to all of us old-timers," he said. "Some gave in, some didn't. I guess you were the first to actually fight back and win. By the end of the day, we'd formed something new. The Silver Lake Property Owners Association, independent of the HOA. It was open only to landowners whose property predated Lakeshore Estates. People who'd been quietly harassed, encroached upon, or simply ignored. Within a week, we had 8 members. At the full court hearing in June, the picture that emerged was damning. The judge reviewed emails, maps, and sworn testimony from residents like Thomas. She concluded that Margaret Kelman and 2 board members had engaged in a systematic campaign to assert control over properties they didn't own. The goal? Inflate HOA assets and secure favorable terms with future investors. The restraining orders were made permanent. The court ordered the HOA to retract and revise all documents, maps, and marketing materials that misrepresented property boundaries. They were fined for filing false architectural violation notices and attempting unauthorized modifications. Harrington, to his credit, took swift and public action. He called a full community meeting, this time on actual HOA property, and announced a complete restructuring of the board. Transparency policies, independent audits, mandatory boundary verification for any future project. He also issued a formal apology on camera at the Lakeside Amphitheater to the property owners who were misled, manipulated, or harassed. "I apologize." And to Mr. Foster, whose quiet resistance brought the truth to light, "You have my gratitude." Margaret, she sold her house within 2 months. Word was she moved to a retirement development in Arizona, one without an HOA. Last I heard, she was arguing with neighbors about cactus height regulations. By Labor Day, Silver Lake was a different place. The new HOA board hosted a community picnic, open to all lakefront residents, member or not. Doug brought his famous smoked brisket. I brought my grandfather's trout dip. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before greeted me like an old friend. I found myself standing next to Edward Harrington again, lemonade in hand. "You know," he said quietly, "this could have ended differently. If you just signed that easement agreement." I chuckled. "I'd still be chasing people off my dock." He nodded. "Fair point. You drew the line. And in doing so, you made the entire community stronger." I looked out over the lake, still serene, and most importantly, mine. "My grandfather always said good fences make good neighbors," I replied. "He just didn't mention you might need security cameras and a lawyer to reinforce them." Harrington grinned. "Amen to that." As the sun dipped below the pines and kids skipped stones across the water, I felt a peace I hadn't known in months. Not just the quiet of the lake, but the quiet of a battle won. Because sometimes, it takes just one person with the right documents and the right amount of stubbornness to remind an entire community where the lines are.